Well, hello. So glad we have the opportunity to continue our study in the miracles of Jesus. We've gotten the opportunity to go through a handful of them so far. I've really appreciated the feedback and the commentary. I hope that these series continue to be edifying to you. I know it is a difficult circumstance we find ourselves in, being unable to meet, but I hope that these studies fill a little bit of that void. They certainly will never be able to replace them completely, but I hope that they give us some ways to think about God's Word and to continue studying into them. We're going to continue in the Gospel of Luke, but the miracle that we're going to look at today kind of gives us actually a good opportunity to discuss something that's going to come up probably a couple of times in our study of the miracles of Jesus, and that is the reality of chronology in the Gospels. In other words, the time of the Gospels. We're going to see several miracles, particularly in the Synoptic Gospels, that are used in different places and sometimes even in different orders of occurring. There's been numerous secular critics and people who have pointed to this as evidence that the Gospels are invalid, the Gospels are not reliable, that they can't even get the order of events straight. And that may be a concern as you're reading through these things. What I want to make you aware of is that it's important for us to not read the Gospels in a way that discredits what they're trying to do. There's going to be different parts of each gospel where they are very strictly concerned with chronology, and there's other parts that they're going to be more concerned with thematic approaches. And so, for example, none of the gospels put the crucifixion before the temptation of Jesus, because that chronology wouldn't make sense. That chronology is important. It's important to understand that the final thing of Jesus' ministry was the crucifixion and then the resurrection. And so there are certain parts of the biblical story that chronology is very important for. There are other times where we're going to see certain miracles are kind of grouped together more based off of a thematic approach. And so remember, we've talked about each of the Gospels is seeking to achieve a slightly different purpose. John is being written to believers. Matthew seems to be written to specifically Jewish believers. That's why we're going to see so many connections with Old Testament prophecies. Mark is likely written to Gentile converts in Rome, and Luke is likely written to a single individual. And so you're seeing kind of different aspects of these different gospel writers. And so they're using these stories to make different points. And so we're actually going to see that as an example today when we look at the healing of Peter's mother-in-law and then some other healings in Capernaum. These events take place roughly after where we just saw last time the healing of the demoniac in Capernaum. And so Jesus is still in that city. He's still working in there. And now we're going to see him kind of continue in this first phase of his ministry. And so what I want to kind of look at is how each of these gospel writers uses these in a slightly different capacity. And so the first one we're going to look at is Luke. And so if you turn over to Luke chapter 4, we're going to see how Luke uses this starting in verse 38. And so again, this is right after he has healed the demoniac in Capernaum in the synagogue. We talked about that last time. This is right after that in the text. He says, "Then Jesus got up and left the synagogue and entered Simon's home. Now, Simon's mother-in-law was suffering from a high fever, and they asked him to help her. Standing over her, he rebuked the fever. It left her, and she immediately got up and waited on them. While the sun was setting, all those who were sick with various diseases brought them to him, and laying his hands on each one of them, he was healing them. Demons also were coming out of many, shouting, 'You are the Son of God.' But rebuking them, he would not allow them to speak, because they knew him to be the Christ. When day came, Jesus left and went to a secluded place, and the crowds were searching for him and came to him and tried to keep him from going away from them. But he said to them, 'I must preach the kingdom of God to the other cities also, for I was sent for this purpose.' So he kept on preaching in the synagogues of Judea." And so Luke presents this account of Simon's mother-in-law being healed. Interestingly enough, this is actually the first time we're introduced to Simon, who we know from having read the Gospels is going to become an apostle. The call of Simon to become apostle actually takes place after this. So in some capacity, Simon and presumably his brother Andrew, maybe even their business partners, James and John, already knew and had some sort of interaction with Jesus. This is supported by what we see in John, where Andrew is a disciple of John the Baptist. And so it's kind of interesting that Jesus is already kind of interacting and aware of the apostles, even though they haven't started becoming his followers yet, which supports the idea of why they drop everything and follow him at the drop of a hat. This is not some stranger doing these things. They're aware of who this is. They're aware of Jesus' nature. But so he heals Simon's mother-in-law. I think it is one of the, I think this is just such a cool little detail that it says he stand over her, he rebuked the fever, which kind of implies perhaps some demon possession here, and it left her, and she immediately got up and waited on them. This just so reminds me of just kind of the stereotypical grandma. Certainly my grandmothers fit this description of they were just so eager to serve. And so as soon as this woman is healed, maybe even has a demon taken out of her, she immediately gets up and starts serving. She starts tidying the house and getting everything ready. It's just such kind of a cool, just down-to-earth image. It's so interesting how the Gospels preserve these little details of, amazing events are occurring. The Son of God has come, but there's also this little old woman who just wants to serve her household. I think that's just such a cool image. And so everybody is hearing about this, and so people are bringing all of their sick, all of their demon-possessed to him. And again, we see this repeated image of the demons identifying the Son of God, Jesus rebuking them and not letting them. And so again, we talked about that last week. There's probably both elements here of Jesus defeating the demons, defeating them even though they know his name, but also the idea that these demons are not the witnesses that Jesus wants to have, that these are not the people that should be identifying the Christ. He's going to want people to come to him on their own terms, discover who he is for themselves. And so he then makes the point that he's not just going to stay in Capernaum, that his ministry is for the entirety of Judea. We see the same account in both the other synoptic gospels. So if you flip over to Mark chapter 1, again, very similar context. We know this is just after the demoniac. We talked about that last time as well. And so it says in verse 29, and immediately after they came out of the synagogue, they came into the house of Simon and Andrew with James and John. So again, notice the parallel with those. Now Simon's mother-in-law was lying sick with a fever, and immediately they spoke to Jesus about her. He came to her, raised her up, taking her by the hand, and the fever left her, and she waited on them. When evening came after the sun had set, they began bringing to him all who were ill and those who were demon-possessed, and the whole city had gathered at the door, and he had healed many who were ill with various diseases and cast out many demons, and he was not permitting the demons to speak because they knew who he was. In the early morning, while it was still dark, Jesus got up, left the house, and went away to a secluded place and was praying there. Simon and his companions searched for him. They found him and said to him, "Everyone is looking for you." He said to them, "Let us go somewhere else to the towns nearby, that I may preach there also, for that is what I came for." And he went into their synagogues throughout all Galilee, preaching and casting out the demons. And so in Mark's account, we see that he's already discussed Simon, Andrew, James, and John becoming his followers. And so his account is a little bit briefer than Luke, but it's taking place before. And so again, we're seeing already that these accounts are not nearly as concerned with chronology as we are. They're approaching this more from a thematic perspective. From Mark's account, Mark already has them as disciples. He already has them working through these things. Again, that doesn't mean that these things are incompatible. Because again, that's not what the Bible is concerned about, is that strict historical chronology that our culture tends to prize. But so we see a little bit of a difference here. We see the same result, that Jesus going out all the synagogues. Here we see him talking more of his personal relationship with the Father. And then finally, we see this same thing in chapter 8 of Matthew, which is after fairly substantial amounts of teaching of Jesus. We've seen he's already had the Sermon on the Mount. We see that he has already called the disciples. And so again, Matthew is definitely probably approaching this more from thematic perspectives. And so he's given a lot of Jesus's teaching. Now he's showing a lot of Jesus's miracles. And so he actually will kind of flip the order. We're going to talk later about the cleansing of the centurion's servant. We're going to talk about the cleansing of the leper. So Matthew is more thematically organized here. But he does the same thing. He says in verse 14 of chapter 8, that when Jesus came into Peter's home, he saw his mother-in-law lying sick in bed with a fever. He touched her hand, and the fever left her, and she got up and waited on him. When evening came, they brought to him many who were demon-possessed, and he cast out the spirits with a word and healed all who were ill. This was to fulfill what was spoken through Isaiah the prophet. He himself took our infirmities and carried away our diseases. And so we see Matthew's point of bringing this up is showing the fulfillment of Old Testament prophecy, that this is in accordance with what we would expect the Messiah to be doing. And so it's really cool to see the different gospel writers using these to emphasize different things. Luke is kind of using this account to show how he's transitioning to a more widespread ministry. Mark is using this to kind of emphasize his relationship, that after he does this, he goes alone to pray. Matthew is using it to emphasize his connection with the Old Testament. And so all of these miracles are being used by the Gospels to demonstrate the same thing. They're demonstrating Jesus' power over healing. It's demonstrating his compassion, that he's healing the sick mother-in-law of one of his disciples. And it demonstrates his power over sickness and over the demons. But they're being used as the same miracle, telling the same story to kind of thematically approach it from a different angle. And so it's one of the really cool things that as you study through the Gospels, you start to see these things, and they're not contradictions. They're not weaknesses in the text. If anything, they show us the importance of approaching each one of these Gospels on their own terms. And so while there is, I think, some merit to bringing everything together and trying to harmonize everything, there's also benefit in reading what each gospel author has written for themselves. I hope this gives you some things to think about. Like I said, this was a little bit more heavy on the technical side, but that's going to be an important thing for us to understand as we go through these miracles, that they are being utilized literarily for different reasons for each of the authors. So hope that gives you some things to think about. Hope that encourages you. We're going to read a lot more accounts of Jesus healing. We're going to read a lot more accounts of Jesus casting out demons. We're going to see a lot more amazing things that these authors are going to have in store for us. So thank you so much for tuning in. We appreciate you guys so much. We love you. We cannot wait for all of this to be done. We appreciate the opportunity to do these things, but we're so ready for the opportunity to be more in touch with you and more in person. Thank you so much. We'll see you again soon.